Hey there, this is your teacher, Mr. H, and you're watching History in a Hoodie. Today's episode is about events of the New South era, where we will learn all about the key political, social, and economic changes of the time period. I can't wait to find out, so let's get this show started. What are we learning about today? The standard for today's lesson asks the students to analyze how rights were denied to African Americans through Jim Crow laws, the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case, disenfranchisement tactics, and racial violence, including the 1906 Atlanta race riot. Additionally, we will examine anti-Semitism and the resistance to racial equality exemplified in the Leo Frank case. Before we start, let's go over some vocabulary for today's lesson. Jim Crow laws were laws passed in the South to limit freedmen's new rights and to keep the public segregated. Segregation means separation of the races. Disenfranchisement means taking away a person's right to vote. A poll tax is a disenfranchisement tactic where voters had to pay more money to vote. Literacy tests were disenfranchisement tactics where voters had to pass a reading test to vote. The grandfather clause was a disenfranchisement tactic which stated that only those whose grandfathers voted in the last election could vote. The white primary is a disenfranchisement tactic which disallowed African Americans from participating in picking the nominees for elections. Plessy v. Ferguson was a Supreme Court case which determined that segregation was legal and established separate but equal. Anti-Semitism means the hatred of Jewish people for their beliefs. Following the end of the military reconstruction in the South, Georgia's politicians were able to pass as many laws as they wanted, making life in the state as close to slavery, short of the 13th Amendment. Any slight gains made by the freedmen during Reconstruction were undone just as quickly. If there is one thing that was clear, in Georgia during the late 1800s it was only acceptable to be white, a harsh reality. The laws that were passed at the start of this era were called the Jim Crow laws. Created by local and state governments that were very anti-freedmen's rights, these laws worked to restore the social, economic, and government order that existed before the Civil War. In society, marrying between the races was strictly forbidden. Segregation of the public areas was required in most every city and town, including separate bathrooms, water fountains, schools, cemeteries, and sections of buses. Economically, many white-owned businesses refused to sell to African Americans, and most white customers refused to buy from black-owned businesses. Politically was the most significant issue because the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote, should have been the biggest step toward equal rights. If politicians didn't treat the freedmen right, they would use their vote to force the politicians to change their minds. Despite the 15th Amendment existing, several southern states enacted laws which made freemen voting nearly impossible. This is called disenfranchisement, or taking away the right to vote, and the southern governments came up with several tactics that were highly effective. The first was the poll tax, or having to pay to vote. Many freedmen were too poor to afford to vote, or didn't consider voting worth the money. The second was the literacy test, requiring voters to take a test before voting. The test was issued randomly, but not really. Almost all those tested were African Americans. The tests were nearly impossible, even for someone who was literate, and due to slavery, many freedmen were illiterate. A final tactic in Georgia was the grandfather clause. This essentially stated that you could vote in the election if your grandfather could vote in the previous election. Again, due to slavery, almost no freedmen passed this requirement. Another political tactic to make sure freedmen didn't win government offices was the white primary. While the 15th Amendment said that African Americans could vote in general elections, it didn't clarify about the primary elections. A quick government primer. A primary election is where 5 Democratic politicians go head-to-head, and where 12 Republican politicians go head-to-head, and the last one standing from each party faces off in the general election. Georgia passed a law which refused to allow African Americans to participate in the primary voting. So, even if a black candidate was running, he would almost certainly be defeated long before the general election. In 1892, some of these Jim Crow laws about segregating society would be put to test in the Supreme Court. Now remember, the Supreme Court's job is to decide if laws are allowed by the Constitution. In the landmark case of Plessy versus Ferguson, Homer Plessy was arrested in Louisiana for sitting in the whites-only section of a train. The Supreme Court ruled that the segregation law created in Louisiana was legal, meaning they could continue to do it. In this decision, the legal concept of separate but equal was created. The justices declared that as long as equal facilities were provided for blacks, their rights weren't being violated. Separate but equal will be the law of the next 70 years. If you were guessing that tensions between the racial groups were high, you wouldn't be wrong. During the New South era, racial conflict was not uncommon. Georgia was home to the second highest number of lynchings, at 482 during this era. In 1906, a falsified article was published in a local Atlanta newspaper, alleging that black men were attacking white women. This lie, probably fabricated due to distrust or jealousy over the success of a few African American business leaders, resulted in a 48-hour riot in downtown Atlanta. One of the largest demonstrations of racial violence in the South, 25 African American men were killed by this mob. Don't think, however, that all the racial hatred in the South was reserved only for blacks, and other groups got away untouched. Anti-Semitism, or the hatred of Jews for their religious belief, was also rampant in the South. Leo Frank, a Jewish man from Atlanta, was accused of murdering a 13-year-old girl. Despite strong evidence of Frank's innocence, a clear alternative suspect who looked very guilty, and eventually a jury verdict that Frank was innocent, that wasn't enough for the local Georgia mob. The unruly citizens were able to walk right into Frank's prison cell, remove him, drive him back to Marietta, and lynch him in the town square. If it better explains how much anti-Semitism was a huge part of society during the era, many of the mob posed for photographs next to Frank's hanging body and sold the photos as souvenirs. Now what? What am I going to do with this information? There is no more important right granted to U.S. citizens in the Constitution than the right to vote. Your ability to vote protects politicians from taking away all of your other rights, like the freedom of speech, freedom to worship the way you choose, and others. That right was supposed to be granted to all African American citizens by the 15th Amendment, but as you've seen today, not so much. It would be another 70 years of Jim Crow disenfranchisement before the Voting Rights Act would be passed that made any attempts to take away voting rights illegal. A very important piece of law, the Voting Rights Act made sure that discrimination could not exist at the voting booth, and led to politicians responding to the needs of all voters, not just one racial group worth. But here's the thing. A couple of years ago, parts of the law were allowed to expire, without Congress voting to continue that law. Immediately following, some states passed laws making it harder to vote. Not easier, harder to vote. First, vote every chance you get. I know it's still a few years away before you're old enough, but I cannot emphasize enough how important voting actually is. Second, keep on the lookout for any leader who wants to limit the right of vote for yourself or anyone else. It may be 2018, but surprisingly, they still exist. Kick that person out of office immediately by voting for a candidate who respects your vote. Freedom like ours doesn't last long if the leaders no longer have to answer to the people. Wow, so learning about social inequity in the South is really important for us to understand. I'm glad we learned it today. Are you ready for some review questions? What was the result of the passage of Jim Crow laws? Why did Georgia's leaders establish policies like the grandfather clause and the white primary during the early 1900s? Due to the lack of enforcement by the federal government, Southern states established many laws that prevented blacks and poor whites from voting. This is called... How does the Leo Frank case reveal aspects of the South's racial tension during the early 1900s? I hope all of you learned a lot from today's episode of History in a Hoodie about the New South era. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Just kidding, I don't care about that stuff. But do make sure you study this lesson. Bye now.